In the summer of 2022, while tearing down an old church hall near Shelby County, Tennessee, a construction worker unearthed a blackened box hidden under the floorboards. Inside was a weather-damaged leather ledger from 1882 labeled Rose Hill Home for Orphaned Youth Register of Inmates. What seemed like a forgotten relic quickly became one of the most unsettling discoveries in state history. Records showed Rose Hill burned down in 1883 with 12 children trapped inside. But the ledger listed 43 names. Each page noted a child's name, age, parentage, and a short comment. Quiet, defiant bedwetter, obedient, until the entries stopped abruptly on May 11th, 1883, 2 weeks before the fire. In the margins were faint pencil marks, strange symbols and X's beside names that never appeared in any official registry after 1883. Names like Ellen Pike, age 7, and Samuel Brown, age 4, simply vanished from history. The ledger was sent to the Tennessee Historical Archives, where archivist Julia Whitmore, a 38-year-old former field investigator, was assigned to review it quietly. But when she reached the final page, where someone had scrawled, "Not fire, not accident, they are still here," she knew this was no routine case. Julia dug into old state records and funding reports, only to find that most were missing or altered. The original fire report listed 19 deaths, later changed to 12 without explanation. The orphanage's superintendent, Elijah Carr, a former Confederate chaplain, disappeared after the fire. No funeral, no trace. As Julia compared documents, she saw names scratched out marked transferred with no destination listed. 2 children even reappeared years later under new names, but without adoption papers. Stranger still, Rose Hill had hired 2 ex-prison guards as night wardens before the fire. Visiting the overgrown ruins, Julia noticed the remains of an unrecorded building once attached to the orphanage's west wall. Locals called it the South Wing. None of the 12 confirmed bodies had been found there. In her notes, she wrote, "This wasn't a fire. It was an erasure." What came next would turn her quiet research into a national story. She began tracing the children's names one by one. Those without X's had records, burials, obituaries, closure. Those with X's had nothing. They had been erased. Through contacts, Julia gained access to a sealed 1905 state report on Appalachian orphanages, which mentioned Rose Hill only once, referencing underground quarters for disciplinary confinement. In the ledger's margins, next to one child's name, someone had written, "Moved below, screaming again." That phrase haunted her. She returned to the ruins, studying original blueprints and discovering a faint marking labeled Sublevel 1 Storage and Quarantine, dated 2 months before the fire. Her search for survivors led her to a 2011 blog post about local hauntings, where a commenter wrote, "My grandmother was at Rose Hill. Said she had to sleep above a locked door." That led Julia to Cora Lang, now 93, living in a nursing home near Covington. When Julia arrived, Cora simply said, "You're the one with the ledger. It's about time." Cora recalled the fire, the panic, the missing children, and the hatch beneath the pantry. Those who misbehaved were taken down there. Only one, a girl named Molly, ever came back silent and broken. 2 days later, the fire began. Cora whispered, "Some say the fire was to stop the crying. Others say it was the children." Julia left shaken, armed with proof of something long buried. She secured a permit and returned to Rose Hill with archaeology students and radar equipment. Beneath the pantry, they found metal buried under brick, a sealed hatch, just as Cora described. It took hours to pry open. Cold air rushed out from the darkness below. Julia descended first. The stairs groaned under her weight, the air thick with decay. At the bottom stretched a narrow corridor lined with wooden doors, each with a small sliding panel. In one room, a rusted bed in manacles. Above it, written in a child's shaky hand, "I promise I'll be good." Another room held a broken doll and words carved deep into stone. "Let me out," repeated, until the marks stopped abruptly. In the third room, a stain on the wall, a child's angel pin glinting faintly in the dust. As Julia turned to leave, her flashlight caught faded chalk writing above the exit. What it said would confirm that Rose Hill's fire was never meant to destroy a building. It was meant to bury the truth. Back on the surface, Julia stood in silence, the fading sunlight painting the trees into the shapes of gallows. Nolan, one of the graduate students who had helped her dig, asked quietly if she thought the children had died down there. Julia didn't answer. She already knew. The walls had told her everything. In her report, she wrote that Sub-Level 1 had never been a storage space at all, but a detention center, a punishment cell for children. The room showed evidence of confinement, restraint, and likely death. The ones marked with X's in the ledger weren't lost in the fire. They were already gone long before it burned. As darkness spread across the tree line, Julia made a silent promise that they would not be forgotten again, and that she would find out who had ordered Sub-Level 1 to be built. The answer came from the same ledger that had started it all. Beneath the stains and faded ink on the final page was a note barely visible. South Wing completed, reinforced, approved by. The signature was mostly erased, but the first letter G was clear. Julia began tracing the trail through the Tennessee Department of Education archives. She found a set of requisitions from 1882 approving funds for Rose Hill's expansion. Each signed, authorized by G. Harrow, Special Committee Liaison. Gideon Harrow, as she soon discovered, was not an educator, but a wealthy coal magnate and a philanthropist who had funded multiple reform institutions for children. His reputation was that of a pious benefactor, but newspaper clippings from the time told another story. One article described a child labor colony he financed in eastern Tennessee, where several children died in a mine collapse. Officials blamed the weather, but an anonymous editorial hinted otherwise, warning that no godly man can ignore the screams rising from beneath our feet. Julia followed Harrow's trail to a long-abandoned mining town called Briar Hollow. The place had been deserted for over a century, ever since its hospital mysteriously burned down. She and Nolan drove 5 hours through winding mountain roads before reaching the crumbling ghost town. The Harrow residence still stood half-sunken and skeletal. But inside its basement, they found a map drawn in charcoal on a stone wall. A blueprint of Rose Hill, complete with room numbers and tunnels. This version, however, showed 3 sub-levels instead of 1. The first was labeled Storage Quarantine, the second Behavioral Correction, and the third, scrawled faintly, Reassignment Gate. Nolan whispered, "What the hell is a reassignment gate?" But Julia's attention was fixed on something else. A sepia photograph pinned beneath a rock. It showed 5 children lined up against a brick wall, hollow-eyed and pale. A tall man in a black coat stood behind them, and across the top someone had written, "Obedient or Gone." One child's face was circled in red, an 8-year-old girl clutching a small armless doll. Julia recognized the doll immediately. She had found it in the second cell under Rose Hill. That night, she wrote in her journal that Rose Hill had not been an orphanage or a refuge. It had been part of a system designed to mold children into obedience or erase them completely. The Harrow map suggested more levels beneath the ruins, and Julia was determined to find them. Guided by the map, she located a second entrance buried under a collapsed chimney 20 feet from the original hatch. It took hours to dig through the debris before revealing another door, steel thicker welded shut from the outside, with one faded word painted across the top gate. When they finally cut through the metal, a foul smell escaped, thick and ancient. A spiral staircase descended into the dark, far deeper than the first sublevel. The deeper they went, the colder it became, until even their voices seemed swallowed by the air. At the bottom lay a stone chamber, circular and dry, lined with metal plates shaped like small footprints, 19 pairs in total. Along the wall, carved in Latin, were the words ex obedient fiant invisibiles, from the obedient, the invisible are made. Scorch marks radiated across the floor, not from fire, but from something explosive, something unexplainable. In the center was a grate covering a vertical shaft that disappeared into darkness. Julia dropped a rock, but it never made a sound. Nolan murmured, "It's a disposal tunnel. They didn't bury the bodies, they sent them down." Julia shook her head. "Not bodies," she said. "Children." In a small adjoining storage room, she found another ledger. This one was simpler, only first names followed by 3-digit numbers and a single letter. Ellen, 234R. Samuel, 236R. Doy, 239R. In the corner was a faded stamp reading RH. Gate Division. Rose Hill, receiving home. But Julia knew the truth. None of these children had ever been received anywhere. They had been erased. The letter R, she realized, didn't mean reassigned. It meant retained. These weren't transfers. They were the ones kept. In her audio log that night, her voice trembled as she whispered that Rose Hill had never been a refuge for the abandoned. It was a filter, a place that sorted children like defective goods. The obedient were placed, the defiant were discarded, and the quiet, the ones who broke but didn't scream, were kept. Days later, Julia uncovered a 19th century donation log showing Rose Hill had requested scientific texts about behaviorism, phrenology, and reflex studies of juvenile subjects. Attached was a handwritten note. Phase 3 requires sensory isolation rooms. Those with low pain response and high obedience are candidates for extended retention. Phase 4 follows upon confirmed spiritual silence. It was signed, Sister Elva. Church archives listed one Sister Elva assigned to Rose Hill. She disappeared 3 weeks before the fire. In the Memphis Historical Society, Julia found her lost notebook, water-damaged but legible. One entry read, Day 213. They've locked room 236 again. Samuel hasn't spoken in days. The walls whisper now. Sister Enid says it's the Lord testing us, but I fear something else grows beneath this place, something that feeds on obedience and rewards silence. They call it the third option. On the final page, 3 faint lines were penciled. The good are rehomed. The bad are sent away. The quiet stay. Julia stared at the words for a long time before whispering into her recorder. This wasn't just cruelty. It was doctrine. A theological hierarchy built on control, where the highest virtue wasn't love or faith, but silence. The third option was where the quiet ones went. Julia returned to the underground chamber the next morning, this time alone. The air was colder than before, still and heavy, as if the earth itself remembered what had been done beneath it. Near room 236, she noticed a loose stone by the floor and pried it free. Beneath it lay a thin slate scratched with a child's drawing stick figures, forming a circle. A tall, faceless shape rising above them, with arms too long to be human. Beneath it, a few simple words etched in childish script. We stood still. It came. The temperature dropped as she examined it. Even though the summer sun burned above ground, the chamber felt drained of all warmth, like the walls had been holding their breath for more than a century. The silence pulsed. The walls seemed to breathe. Room 236 looked like the other's small, cot-rusted bucket, but this one had no restraints, no chains. The entire back wall was smooth worn down, as if dozens of small bodies had pressed against it for hours, days, maybe longer. Then she saw them, dozens of handprints embedded in the stone, small, deliberate, forming a perfect circle, all facing inward. Not panicked, not random. Ritual. She stepped back, the image of the drawing flashing in her mind, the circle, the figure, the phrase. We stood still. As she lifted her camera, her flashlight flickered. For a moment, the shadows seemed to move, and in the dim light she heard something breathing in the dark. Not her. Soft, rhythmic, like a child trying not to be found. She fled the room, but her foot hit something metal, a rusted tin lunchbox. Inside was a faded blue ribbon, a small button carved with a rose, and a cloth scrap with a name stitched in careful thread. Doi, the name from the ledger. She had been real. She had been here, and she had never left. That night, Julia laid everything on the motel table, the ledgers, the photo, Sister Elva's journal, the slate, the tin box. Then she saw it. 5 names repeated across every artifact, 5 children circled in the photo, all marked reassigned in the ledger. They hadn't been reassigned. They'd been chosen. They weren't punished, Julia wrote. They were stalled, as if someone was waiting, as if their silence was the key. The reassignment gate wasn't the end. It was the threshold. Early the next morning, her phone buzzed. A voicemail. Nolan's voice trembled through static. I found another door below the drain. It wasn't on the blueprints. Julia. There are names on the wall. Fresh ones. Julia, I think they're still here. The message ended with his breathing, then silence. She called back again and again, but there was no signal. Only a faint hum, like a lullaby without words. Outside, the wind carried that same rhythm, children's breaths in perfect time. Julia drove straight to Rose Hill before dawn. Fog clung to the ground like smoke from an old fire. She didn't wait for light. With her headlamp and recorder, she descended. The spiral stairs moaned as she passed the circle of handprints and reached the metal grate Nolan had mentioned. It was open now. The drain below led into a crawl space barely 4 feet high. The air was hot, wet, and wrong. She crawled 20 yards before the tunnel widened into a hidden corridor, supported by rotted beams like the ribs of a mine. The air shifted, breathing, moving on its own. The passage bent sharply, leading into a row of tiny stone rooms. Each one bore names carved freshly into the walls, the grooves still damp. Samuel, Ellen, Clara. And at the far end, a blank wall with a single word scratched into it. Her name. Julia. She called out for Nolan, but the only reply was a low murmur. Many voices whispering from behind the stone, too soft to be words, too many to be alone. She stepped into the final chamber. It was empty except for Nolan's wristwatch lying on a slate board. The second hand ticked steadily. On the slate, written over and over in a child's hand, were the words. We were good. We stayed still. We waited. Julia knelt to touch it. The stone was warm. A breath of air swept past her face, though there were no vents. Then came the tapping, slow, deliberate. She turned toward the wall. The names had changed. Her own had been added again, this time freshly etched, the stone still bleeding dust. Her flashlight flickered. A sound rose behind her, a chant quiet and rhythmic. We stood still. We stood still. We stood still. The air thickened. Shadows stretched across the walls, moving like something with too many limbs. No footsteps, just breath. just the sound of names being carved one after another. In her last voice memo, Julia's voice trembled. They're not ghosts. They're not echoes. They're arrested. Like time froze their obedience and made it sacred or hungry. They're waiting for him, whoever he was, and now they think I'm part of it. I think Nolan's been taken in. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Daddy, if you're still here, I saw your doll. I remember. I'm sorry we didn't come sooner. Then the recorder caught a faint scraping sound. One word etched slowly into the wall beside her. Okay. Julia left Rose Hill after midnight, driving until her hands shook. She didn't go home. She went to the Memphis Diocesan Archives, broke in through the back reading room, and spent hours digging through forgotten correspondence from the 1870s. At 4:17 a.m., she found a sealed envelope marked Ad Sum Internum, Eyes of the Cloister. Inside were letters between Father Ansel Boone, head of Rose Hill, in 1882, and someone identified only as Rector M. from St. Brolio's Theological Asylum, a facility closed after accusations of experiments on mute children. The letters discussed subjects responsive to divine silence and the viability of self-erasure among unformed moral agents. One paragraph made her blood run cold. We've selected 14. Most are pliant. The few who resist will be culled. The rest will be offered in stillness. The Lord of Obedience speaks only through mouths closed in reverence. He responds to quiet. He dines on memory. He grows where guilt is strongest. Julia read the words aloud, her voice barely a whisper. He dines on memory. It wasn't metaphor, it was instruction. The children of Rose Hill hadn't just vanished. They had been consumed by something the church had never named, but had clearly served. Something that fed on silence and called it holy. The final letter in the packet was unsigned, written in the neat, deliberate hand of someone trained to conceal emotion. It listed child subjects by initials and marked each as either received or R. Most bore the R. At the bottom was a single phrase in Latin. Infantis sentis specula. The silent children are mirrors of God. Julia stared at the words, understanding now that this wasn't theology. It was a manual. The church hadn't created doctrine. It had engineered ritual logic, an equation that turned obedience into sacrifice. She checked the names again in the Rose Hill ledger. Doy, Clara, Samuel, Ellen. Each had appeared before in an 1879 transfer registry from St. Brolio's Theological Asylum. They weren't orphans. They were subjects moved between institutions for further refinement. Silenced, preserved, offered. Back in her motel, Julia turned on her recorder. He wasn't a man, she said softly. He was a theology, a construct. A ritual that demanded real children, real stillness, real disappearance. Father Boone believed silence could make a soul eternal. But what they summoned? I don't think it left. She shut the recorder off and sat in the dim blue light of her laptop. The room felt heavier than air. Behind her, something shifted. She turned. Nothing. But in the condensation on the mirror, one word had appeared. Listen. She froze. Beneath the hum of the air conditioner, she heard whispering, layered voices, childlike, speaking through breath instead of words. He is still hungry. Julia didn't remember falling asleep. When she woke, 2 hours had vanished. Her voice recorder was running, and her own voice filled the room, whispering the same sentence again and again. I am quiet. I am ready. 43 times. Her notebook was torn, her pen missing, her car keys tucked beneath her pillow. The mirror was blank now, but when she exhaled near it, one word bloomed again in the fog: come. She drove to Rose Hill before dawn. This time she didn't stop at the sublevel. She went deeper, past the corridor through the cracked wall marked waiting. Behind it was a narrow cavity barely wide enough to crawl through. On the other side, the space twisted unnaturally, not carved, but grown stone, curving inward like ribs, like a womb. In the center was a ring of broken toys, each tagged with a single name: Julia. Her stomach turned. They couldn't be hers. She didn't remember them. Yet one, the doll with a glass eye and blue ribbon, triggered something. A flash of light. A hallway. A nun's shadow bending close. A tray of silver tools. A voice whispering, "This one doesn't cry." Her phone died. The recorder wouldn't turn on. The air vibrated a low hum just beyond hearing a sound that felt like pressure on her bones. The voice didn't come from outside this time. It spoke inside her, a dozen small tones weaving together. We waited. We were good. We didn't speak. He took what was heavy. But you brought the noise back. Now feed it. Julia's thoughts splintered. The whisper filled her skull like water. She couldn't think, only feel. The scream that left her body made no sound. Somewhere inside the chaos, she managed to scrawl in her notebook. He doesn't eat flesh. He eats noise, thought, conflict. The children starved themselves of self until he came. I feel him in my teeth. She ran, crawled through the tunnels until her knees bled. When she reached the main chamber again, the names on the walls were gone. Every one of them replaced by a single word carved over and over: Julia. She didn't recognize it anymore. It wasn't her name now, just a sound meant to be quieted. She left Rose Hill before sunrise. She hadn't spoken a word in hours, not because she wouldn't, but because her mouth no longer obeyed her. When she tried to say, "My name is Julia," the mirror answered, "We are listening." When she tried again, the reflection moved out of sync and whispered, "We remember what was taken." Her journal entries began writing themselves, phrases spilling from her shaking hands. Let the quiet feed. Obedience is nourishment. She will speak no more. She slammed the notebook shut, desperate for something human, something alive. That's when she found the name: Father Amos Greer, a surviving novice from St. Brolio's, now 94, and living in assisted care outside Chattanooga. She drove 6 hours without stopping. When she entered his room, the old man was already awake, his eyes cloudy, but waiting. "You've been marked," he said softly. Julia nodded, trembling. "It's inside me." He didn't look surprised. "It feeds on the unspeakable," he said. "That's why they use children. They don't lie. Their silence is clean." We called him the listener, beneath not God, not demon, but something that grows where sound dies. Julia asked how to stop it. The old man exhaled a sound like prayer and defeat. "You can't close the mouth from inside it," he said. "But maybe you can sing." That night, Julia spoke into her recorder again. The voice inside her still murmured, but it faltered when she sang nonsense rhymes, fragments of lullabies, half-remembered poetry. The rhythm broke its hold. It recoiled from chaos, from imperfection. "He hates language," she whispered. "Real language. The kind that moves." She understood now the children had been taught obedience until their thoughts went still, until something else could think for them. They had waited for a voice to fill their silence, and now that voice was hers. At 3:12 a.m., a file appeared on her laptop. No sender, just a single recording. Nolan's voice. If you're hearing this, I didn't make it back. They tried to make me part of it. Don't let him have your ears. Remember what you told me, noise saves. Julia stared at the mirror. For the first time in days, her reflection moved with her. My name is Julia, she whispered. The reflection smiled faintly, not hers. Then in perfect unison, both voices spoke. Rose Hill is waiting. The tunnels breathed as if alive, the air shifting with the slow awareness of something ancient remembering her. The walls no longer resisted her steps. They seemed to open, guiding her forward. It was time. Julia passed through the cracked wall behind the corridor of names deeper than she had ever gone. She carried 3 things: a small portable speaker, a handwritten list of 53 children's names, and a recorder set to loop one file, her own childhood voice singing, "You are my sunshine." Not perfect, not in tune, but human. The chamber of toys was darker now, slick with moisture. The air throbbed like a heartbeat, thick and heavy. Julia placed the speaker in the center of the room and pressed play. Her young voice filled the space, fragile, trembling, real. The walls rippled. From the ceiling, drops of condensation rose instead of falling. The air distorted, bending around unseen shapes, too small to be adults, too many to count. She could feel them gather around her, invisible but tangible, waiting. Then he came. Not a figure, not a shadow, but a weight in the air, a pressure flattening everything around her. The music warped, the speaker crackled her ears, filled with a low electric hum. The voice slid back into her mind, cold and smooth. You brought song into sanctuary. You woke the memory. You will be erased. Julia screamed, not in fear, but in defiance. She screamed the children's names, one by one, her voice raw and shaking. Doy, Ellen, Will, Samuel, Clara. You are not forgotten. The walls convulsed. The air buckled. He tried to press into her mind again, but this time she didn't retreat. She shouted nonsense, prayed, cursed, sang, laughed, every sound that didn't belong in silence. Every word became a strike against him. Then faint at first, a voice answered her. A small broken voice singing along. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. Then another joined, then more. Dozens, hundreds. Children's voices, brittle but beautiful, rising from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself. You make me happy. The sound swelled until the chamber trembled. The silence screamed back, not with noise, but with collapse. The air shattered. The walls cracked. The circle of toys exploded outward. The handprints peeled themselves from the stone and vanished one by one, fading like breath on glass. Julia fell to the floor as everything went still. When she opened her eyes, it was morning. She was lying at the mouth of the Rose Hill gate. Her name had been scratched into the dirt beside her. Julia, and beneath it 3 more words. You broke it. Later, investigators found the underground structure collapsed. No bodies, no tunnels, only 50 small objects arranged in a perfect circle of ash dolls, marbles, shoes, buttons, all tagged with names that matched Julia's list. On the corridor wall above the ruins, someone had carved a message. We sang. We remembered. We were seen. Julia woke in a hospital 2 days later. Her body was dehydrated, her throat bruised but intact. When doctors asked what had happened, she tried to explain, but when she lied even a little, her voice disappeared completely. The state condemned the property, sealed the site, and buried the records. No crimes proven, no bodies found. Only whispers and one surviving recording Julia's voice looping names into the static. She never released her final podcast episode. Instead, she uploaded a 10-minute piece titled Rose Hill, Names We Still Know. It was nothing but names spoken slowly, layered with static and the faint echo of children repeating them. No narration, no explanation, just remembrance. The world listened. 7 million plays in the first week. One evening, a small package appeared on her doorstep. No return address. Inside was a doll with a cracked glass eye, a blue ribbon tied around its neck, and a leather-bound ledger. The ink was old, the handwriting small and unsteady. Across the first page, Children of Rose Hill, Witness Records. Signed in looping letters, Doi May, age 8. It wasn't a register, it was a journal written by a child. Dozens of entries filled the pages, some barely legible. We don't talk, but I remember them. If I forget them, he gets bigger. So I write them down. I write so we stay real. I write so we don't go flat. Another entry read, Julia was here once. I think she came before. On the final page, the ink was smudged, but the message clear. If someone finds this, sing for us, so we stay. Julia closed the ledger and held it against her chest. That night she sang again, quietly, off-key, imperfect. And from somewhere deep inside her, a single note answered. Not from the room, from within. A voice not hers, a voice not alone. 2 months passed. Julia spoke little and published nothing more. But at night, when the world was silent and the air was still, the ledger would whisper, not words, not literally, just a soft, rhythmic breath, like someone listening, like a song waiting to begin again. But every time Julia opened the ledger, something had changed. New pages appeared, fresh names, dates, even sketches, though she hadn't touched a pen. Some of the handwriting looked like hers. She started mapping the entries, tracing the towns and orphanages listed beside them, until a terrible pattern took shape. Rose Hill was not alone. There were others. St. Aurelia's Refuge outside Baton Rouge, the Hollow House in Appalachia, Pine Hill Shelter for the Disordered deep in the Mississippi Delta, Blessing Creek Missionary Camp in northern Alabama. Each founded between 1867 and 1878, each run by clergy or doctors connected to the church, and each abruptly closed without explanation. Every one of them lost to flood or fire, everyone erased. Julia dug deeper. Newspaper archives, parish records, land deeds. The same phrasing echoed again and again. Incident undisclosed facility, condemned records unavailable. She pulled up satellite images and found ruins scattered across the South like scars. Only one site remained mostly intact, Pine Hill Shelter. Zooming in, she saw 3 faint, overlapping circles carved into the courtyard stone. The same symbol that had marked the corridor where the names in Rose Hill had vanished. Flipping back through Doy's ledger, she noticed something written so faintly it was almost invisible. He wears different walls now. Julia felt the truth settle into her bones. Rose Hill hadn't been the beginning, it had been a vessel, a shrine, a mouth. There were others still breathing beneath the soil, still listening, still hungry. She packed her recorder, her maps, and Doy's ledger. That night, as she stood before the mirror, she whispered, "Do you still hear them?" And from her own reflection, and something behind it, came the answer. Yes, and more. The gates to Pine Hill hung open. No guards, no signage, just silence. Inside, Julia found children, 10, maybe 12, sitting in neat rows, hands folded, eyes blank, mouths closed. A woman in plain clothes approached, smiling softly. "You're here for the evaluation?" Julia hesitated. I used to be a journalist." "Used to be," the woman asked gently. Julia didn't answer. The dormitory was almost identical to Rose Hill, the same stone basin, the same triangular pulpit, and carved behind the altar, the same 3 interlocking circles. This wasn't imitation. It was continuation. "What's this program called?" Julia asked. "We are the Covenant of Renewal," the woman said. "We help broken children. We teach them to listen." Julia's blood went cold. "Do they speak?" "Not yet," the woman said, smiling. "But silence is the first step to healing." Julia sat beside one of the children, a boy with wide, terrified eyes who wouldn't meet hers. She showed him the doll with the cracked glass eye. He blinked once. A single tear fell down his cheek. Quietly, Julia began to hum, "You are my sunshine." For a moment his lips trembled, forming the ghost of a word. That was enough. That night, she slipped out of Pine Hill without a sound. But before leaving, she placed a flash drive in the chapel, a looped recording of every sound she had gathered from Rose Hill. Not just the song, but laughter, sobs, shouts, all the chaos of being human. Noise, life. Then she uploaded it everywhere she could. Radio frequencies, library servers, forgotten data vaults. The broadcast carried one title: "Open Mouths Cannot Be Claimed." Its closing line spread faster than she ever expected. If they tell you silence is holy, ask whose voice it serves. Some called it blasphemy. Others called it deliverance. But across the world, children began singing again in their homes, in streets in places long ruled by quiet. They sang old songs, wrong songs, songs that didn't make sense. And in the dark places where the stone had sealed itself for more than a century, the cracks began to spread. Beneath the soil, something shifted. Not rising this time, receding. Because for the first time in generations, there were names waiting.